Our set of notes for today is titled The Massachusetts Colony. And in it, we're going to be exploring the settlement of the second major colony in English America. Virginia had been settled already, starting with the Jamestown settlement in 1607. And in 1620, we're going to have the start of the second colony in Massachusetts. So our notes are going to be broken into three parts, starting with the Pilgrims. So first off, who were they? Well, to understand who the Pilgrims are, you have to understand who the Puritans are. The Puritans were a group in England that was very critical of the Anglican or the English church. They were called Puritans because they wanted to purify the church. They felt that it was too similar to the Catholic Church. It was too similar in some of the practices and some of the rituals, and they wanted to change that. They wanted to purify it. And the Puritans believed that you didn't need these big fancy rituals, that each person should be able to read and interpret the Bible for himself or herself. The Pilgrims were a particular group of Puritans. So they're a smaller group of Puritans who were like extreme. They were so fed up with the English church that they didn't even want to stay in England and attempt to reform it or purify it. They were ready to completely separate, to completely break away. And so sometimes the Pilgrims were called separatists because they wanted to completely break away from the English church. So in 1620, a group set sail to Massachusetts on a ship called the Mayflower. And on this ship, about half of the settlers were Pilgrims, and the other half were not. They were what the Pilgrims called the strangers. These were people who were not coming for religious reasons, but just to join the settlement and to start a new life in America. And right away, they run into some very serious problems that needed to be dealt with. A lot of them were sick. Over that 2-month voyage, quite a few people got sick on the ship. There's also the fact that they were supposed to be somewhere else. They were aiming to go to Virginia, and they didn't have permission from the king to be in Massachusetts. Some people in that group called the strangers felt that they really didn't need to listen to the Puritan leaders because they weren't even in the right place. And it was cold. It was November in New England. It's cold. They needed shelter. They needed food. They needed fuel, wood to burn. So, to deal with these problems, they wrote and signed a very important document called the Mayflower Compact. And it said that they would work together, that they would be able to elect representatives to make decisions, quote, for the general good of the colony. And everybody agreed to obey just and equal laws. This is a very important document because it was the very first written framework for self-government in the American colonies. You had self-government in Virginia. They had started establishing democracy with the House of Burgesses. But here, they had to start completely from scratch, and they decided we are going to choose self-government and democracy as the basis for our government, as the basis for making the rules. This takes us to part 2, the Puritans. Once Massachusetts is established, it doesn't take long for word to get out that there is this settlement based on religious freedom and democracy. So between 1630 and 1640, about 20,000 Puritans came to Massachusetts. Well, why? Well, for one, they, like the Pilgrims, had gotten pretty unhappy with the king. They felt they weren't being treated right, and they wanted to worship their own way. They were also excited by the idea of this new settlement. They felt that this new settlement could be a model for others. It could be a model for the world, what one of the religious leaders called a city on a hill, right? That people would look to Massachusetts as an example of how they should behave. In Massachusetts, they set up a government based on a charter, meaning a license from the king, and each town was governed by the male church members. Each town would choose a member of what they called the general court, kind of like the House of Burgesses in Virginia, and it came up with the laws for the colony. At first, the general court elected whoever the governor would be, and then they changed that and decided they would allow the male church members to vote for him directly. So, some other evidence of democracy. The governor would be in charge and would serve for 1 year, and then they would have another election. Sometimes towns became a bit too crowded. If this happened, any group of settlers could apply to the general court to set up a new town, set up their own town. You had to have 20 families, and because it was a religious settlement, you had to have a Puritan minister as well. If your request was approved, you would get a large piece of land to start your town, and then the townspeople could distribute that land any way they liked. So as towns start to spread and Massachusetts starts to grow, let's discuss what life was like. Well, for one, everyone was part of a town, right? Communities were based on towns. If a town had 50 or more families, it was required to have a free public school. The male church members ran the town through regular town meetings. This was really the basis of democracy in Massachusetts, the town meeting. And at every town meeting, any eligible male could speak out on the important issues. They would choose who their officials would be, and they would vote on taxes and laws for the town. And they would decide how land would be given out. And again, very religious colony, they would figure out how to provide for a church. Citizens were all expected to pitch in to help build fences, repair roads, defend the town against any dangers, right? You get this idea of the militia. You see the picture of the Minuteman statue. If you were a Puritan, you could live there. You could live in the town, but you couldn't vote, you couldn't hold office. So there's democracy, but not everyone gets to take part. So here's your response question. Based on what you've learned so far, what are some similarities and some differences between Virginia and Massachusetts? What are some of the similarities you can tell between the two? What are some differences you can tell between the two? Fill in your response question, print out your notes before the next class.